So hey everyone. Today I'm here with Orta Therox. Orta is a prominent open source contributor. His contributions span the range of popular JavaScript and TypeScript projects. They include things like Prettier, React, Relay, GraphQL, Cocoapods, and of course TypeScript. And what's interesting is they cover kind of the full dimensions of design, project management, and code with kind of a special emphasis on developer education and making these awesome technologies accessible to everyone. So really excited to be talking with Orta today. He's also the author of the TypeScript Playground and probably a lot of the design of the TypeScript language docs.
Yeah,
So
all of it.
excited to be, yeah, all of it. So Orta, thanks so much for being with us here today.
Thanks. I'm honored. The Sourcegraph podcast has so many good, interesting episodes that I've been listening to catch up on this. So I'm really pumped to be here, and thanks for having me.
Cool. Awesome. So I'd like to kick things off with kind of a personal question. You've obviously done a lot of great work as a developer and designer and open source contributor. I'm dying to know, where did the journey start for you? What's your origin story as a programmer?
I think that in theory, I probably have two true origin stories here. So
Okay.
I'll say them in order. There's deciding to be a programmer and sort of first starting to do some like interesting programs, which for me was the process of being interested in video games and then being interested in making my own video games, and that sort of gradual using a game maker toolkit style thing, like Mario
Yeah.
Maker's a good example, and then sort of evolving that to a point where you needed programming in order to actually do something harder.
Yeah.
Um, and that sort of evolved quite naturally into like building tools for building games, and then it turned out that I spent more time building the tools than making the games, which is usually a good indicator that you're into building tools and not necessarily into building games.
Yeah.
And so I sort of oriented how I was learning and what I was doing to sort of focus more on user interface toolkits and how bits come together. But the second part is more like interesting to this, which is like, at what point did I realize that open source was something that I really wanted to like focus the last decade of my life on, for example.
Yeah.
And for me, that was I grew up in a small town about an hour away from the closest big city, which is Manchester,
Hmm.
with basically no sort of mentorship resources available in programming.
Yeah.
And as a budding Mac developer back in the day, I really just wanted to know what it looks like to build big apps. And so I used apps like Quicksilver, Colloquy, Adium, all these things we don't really use anymore.
Yeah. That takes me back.
Yeah,
Quicksilver. I remember that. That was awesome.
they were all open source. And so I would read the code, try and understand how all the pieces came together, take it apart, re-put it back together again. And through that, I learned how to do it. And today there's so much resources to learn to program in different ways, and a million different angles you could do it. But for me, the best one was look at code, read it, understand it, move on. And I've always wanted to be able to do that for the next set of people. Like not everyone wants to learn by watching a video, not everyone wants to learn by reading a
Yeah.
book or a tutorial. In
Yeah.
fact, that we mentioned the TypeScript Playground, right? The TypeScript Playground is exactly what I would have wanted to learn TypeScript from. It's a place to tinker in a safe environment that's easy to share.
Yeah.
Um, and that's how I ended up doing open source at scale, slowly and
Yeah.
slowly, just like contributing more and more to these bits.
I think that's one of the joys of software development, especially in the present era. You can just, there's so many things that you can kind of open up the hood of and peek under and learn how it works yourself. Um, and
Yeah.
it's really cool. So I understand, like now today, like all the work that you do is in the open, right? Because
Yes.
you so firmly believe in kind of contributing back to the ecosystem that helped you get stood up.
Yeah, I used to, I guess I still can joke that GitHub follows me on Twitter. So it's a bit like, being so active on Facebook that Facebook starts following you.
Yeah.
Like, is that a good thing?
Yeah.
But, now that I work for Microsoft, that we're colleagues, GitHub and I, in theory.
Yeah. Yeah. That's awesome. Um, so okay, so you kind of like came for the video games, but stayed for the open source. And it sounds like you got started in open source on Mac. And was Cocoapods kind of the first big community that you jumped into?
Yeah, Cocoapods was the biggest open source community in sort of the Mac sphere before iOS anyway.
Yeah,
In part, there's like the idea of a tent pole on a circus. You have the big sort of thing that creates the ecosystem.
yeah,
That was Cocoapods, because prior to having a dependency manager, everybody would just upload a tar file somewhere, and you'd download it and put it into your project. And then if you wanted an update, you would move the files over and make sure the settings are changed. And Cocoapods
yeah,
changed that. And I wanted my work to have the sort of maybe not exponential, but I wanted the work I had to be multiplied by the sort of the ecosystem I was working on. And so
yeah,
any time spent on Cocoapods improved, like was a multiplier on everybody else's time. And so it felt like a very valuable use of my own time in my spare time to work on this dependency manager that was pretty budding when I got to it.
yeah,
And by the time, I'm still pretty actively involved as far as everyone else is. 10 years later, and having moved, from native development to React Native development to working purely on TypeScript. So, two serious hops away from that sort of thing every day. But,
yeah.
sometimes you just need somebody that's been doing it for long enough to still be around to make decisions.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I feel like if you're just getting into development these days, it kind of like spoiled because every major language ecosystem I think has a package manager now, and it's seen as like table stakes.
Yeah.
But back in the day, so to speak, iOS Objective C, there's no like package management system, and so
Yep.
before CocoaPods is like
Nothing.
nothing.
And like before then, the ecosystem vendor Apple just said that's not a problem that needs to be solved. Like you shouldn't
Yeah,
be sharing code, was actually their opinion.
yeah,
And thus like Cocoapods was reactionary even to that. The idea that like open source could exist was a push in that ecosystem at the time. It's
yeah.
much less now, obviously.
How did you go from kind of Mac and iOS like native development into the JS and TS and web world?
Pretty smooth transition. I was forced into it. um, there was, you
How
know,
so?
well, React Native is such a compelling use case in comparison to native code.
Mm,
I had wrote native code for about 10 years when React Native had come along.
yeah.
And I knew all of the flaws of native code, which, that can also be seen as positives, but also like
What
iteration
are the
times.
what are like the big trade offs in your mind?
So native code tends to be more complicated because systems tend to be more separated. And
Mm,
so okay, to give more specific examples, think about it as like, if your website required you to code sign one part differently to another part, if you wanted to embed some sort of like the if your mobile version of your app had to not be sharing a domain, but it had to be a completely separate app bundle that would be included, but may
yeah,
also have different code signing rules. And all of those, each one of those also needs to be compiled in specific ways. um, all those are reasonable problems that you solve once or twice a month, but the hard one is just iteration times are absolutely terrible.
hmm,
And especially if you're targeting for a device that's not the device you're working on, then suddenly you have to build for that device, send it over, restart whatever simulator emulator you've got going, and then you're up and running, and you lose all state and things like that. And
hmm,
Apple definitely took about a decade to get on board with trying to improve that iteration cycle. But realistically, even their current approach, which is Swift UI, it doesn't actually run your code and sort of hot reload it. It actually runs it separately in a sandbox that isn't your application. So it's not actually
Oh,
that
interesting.
accurate. It's just close enough.
Huh.
And so you still don't get the React style, I press save and it does it all, and all
Yeah,
those things
it's
were like
magical.
such compelling cases to React Native, the you know there was just so much React advantage, and then there was also we got the advantage of using Relay, which is a really powerful way of connecting your API to your client. And we said that the apps that I was working on at Artsy, these were apps that were just pretty JSON parsers. And native development SDKs, these are really built for building like long running applications like web browsers or I know your music player, messaging apps, not this sort of quick like get me some JSON data, put it on a screen, and then don't do anything until you click something next.
Yeah.
And so React Native provided these much better abstraction layers to be building these sorts of almost web pages style applications. So it was very easy once we'd made the transition to think in terms of React instead of in thinking in terms of like individual native toolkits.
Got it. So that was a decision. You were working at Artsy at the time, and so,
Yes.
so the team made kind of that decision to transition over from just like native iOS development to React Native.
Yep, just for iOS, and then I think 3 years later, just a little bit after I left, launched an Android app.
Yeah. So one of the things I really appreciate about your work is it's not just about the code for you; it's also about the design and the accessibility of the documentation. And you mentioned that you used Relay, and I know that you were played a major hand in the design or redesign of the Relay doc. So can you talk about that experience? Like, how did you come to get involved in that?
So to give anybody that doesn't know background on Relay, if you've heard of GraphQL, Relay was the thing that people were meant to like, and GraphQL was meant to be the sort of side thing that powered Relay, and instead it turned out to be the opposite way around. But Relay is a sort of almost like a compiler level checking of all of your sort of your GraphQL queries in an application. And it really binds them tight together, the user interface and the API schema, in ways that like, today people will do using sort of, CodeGen and things like that. But a lot of Facebook open source projects are open source in name and maybe less in spirit, in the fact that like what they are doing is they are shipping open source code, and they are generally contributing back to the ecosystem, but like these projects are Facebook led for Facebook, and you guys can use them if you'd like to. So Flow has very explicitly stated that very recently. And Relay is that way, and if you've talked to anybody that uses it, then they'll know that, because
this is in contrast to like other open source projects that have more of like an independent community-led development. Is that?
Yeah, I think the contrast there is that like TypeScript's a good example of like the furthest edge of like TypeScript's a little bit dictatorial, like we're the only people that make the hardest decisions, the TypeScript team. Whereas something like Rust will have pure RFCs for everything, and it's very democratic. But in all these cases, that is like open source, where the community gets equal input to like bugs, features, and pull requests, and the core contributors take the time to make sure that like that we keep the community PRs smoothly moving in, and we don't let them pile up too much. On a project like Relay, that's much harder because the engineers don't have time to work full time on the community management aspects of it, which is very time consuming at the sort of scales at which we're talking about here. You should feel some of that. Sourcegraph has like quite a lot of developers doing a lot of interesting work. And so for Relay, there was just doing documentation, trying to explain Relay, and trying to sort of get people involved and understand like what the relationship will be between them and Facebook is actually was not like pitching it wasn't really a priority to them. They were just happy that like they had it open source. They don't necessarily want it to become as big as some of the like GraphQL libraries that are out there, because that just means more work for them in their spare time. And so we adopted it early at Artsy, and we actually spent a lot of time explaining regularly to new employees and to other sort of community members why we use Relay. And instead of explaining it enough times, I took a bunch of rough blog posts that I'd had on the concept and sort of pitched to the Relay team that I should redesign their homepage that answers a lot of the questions that people are asking us at Artsy about Relay, and move that out into their official sort of introduction to their process. And it was fun. It's always an interesting problem trying to do, like, how do you pitch an open source project? We struggle with it right on TypeScript. I'm on the 5th redesign of the TypeScript homepage right now.
Wow.
And this one might be good enough to go public with, but we're still not sure.
What do you think about when you go into a redesign like that, and maybe like with Relay specifically? How did Facebook message or market it originally, and what were kind of like the major changes that you made in explaining what it exactly did?
Yeah. So, I mean, if you think about what a normal Docusaurus website would look like, Docusaurus is this really great static site builder, and it comes with a pretty solid template to start with. It's just, centered title, bit of green text, and then 3 little boxes. Relay was basically that, which said, Relay is a GraphQL client for JavaScript, and it is strong and secure because it has a compiler. It is fast because it is very, very fast. It's a bit like when you use ESBuild and you're like, did that actually happen?
Yeah, ESBuild is so fast. It kind of completely resets expectations for what's possible in the
totally
JS toolchain world.
Yeah. And that's basically what that's all they tell you. They tell you that, like, the thing underneath is very fast. And that the thing is very secure, in terms of like the data that you get wrong. But trying to you can't just describe Relay and those things, because like somebody's going to put that next to the Apollo homepage, of which, Apollo has a lot of great designers and developers trying to figure out what is the right way to sell a GraphQL client.
Apollo is another like end-to-end GraphQL framework. Also has a great company behind it.
Yeah, like they're part of the sort of current generation of open source cool kids like Gatsby, Vercel. And Apollo is a perfect competitor to Relay because it does a few similar things, but has a lot of different ways of doing it. It's very JavaScripty, and there's lots of different plugins you can build together a very clever and complicated system. And Relay, on the other hand, doesn't allow any of that. It's just one thing. It's just Relay, and has to be everything in one. It's a bit like Babel versus TypeScript. And so, what I did instead was sort of tell the story of Relay. Like, why would someone want to use a system that is quite blatantly more complicated than the version that you've probably already heard of, right? So if you care about GraphQL clients, then you probably already know about Apollo because they do a great job and a lot of people use it. And so somebody's coming to Relay already with a thing of like, this is probably what I'm going to use, but I'm just checking out the competitors. To give myself a feel, like to know that I am making a reasonable decision because I've at least checked the other avenues. And so you need to be able to talk someone through, like, okay, here's why you should care about this particular feature, which is, fragments are the main way in which you interact with GraphQL queries, which if you don't know what fragments of GraphQL queries are, it doesn't matter. But like, it is just like the way in which you think about it requires a different abstraction to the way in which you normally think about it. And to get you there, you really have to explain it like 3 or 4 steps before that. You can't just have a single line that says use fragments to tie your queries to whatever's. You really have to be like, this data is needed here, but not here. And if you use a fragment, then it will appear only there. And that description required like so many levels of iteration to get to a point where it reads pretty reasonably and you feel like you actually understand how you got to a decision to use this and why Facebook use it still, right? They rewrote the entire Facebook.com using Relay everywhere. And Supposedly they love it in Facebook, but don't know how they got around the lack of docs. But I think they've been doing a lot of work on that lately to try and fix that. In part because they redid the Facebook.com on it.
Yeah, it's so funny to see the contrast between level of documentation for open source projects versus internal libraries. You would think that if this is something that's important enough to be private and part of your company's core code base, that documentation would be a first order concern. But there's a huge documentation gap.
Yeah, I bet it's the opposite's completely different, right? It's like, this is just our code. Nobody needs to see it. We don't need to document it. You can just go and tap on someone's shoulder and find out the answer instead of writing it. Yeah, it's very difficult. And then people think that if it's open source, then it does need to be better documented because it's a representation of what your internals look like to the rest of the world. So
yeah. So you've kind of I think one of your I guess like goals has been to up level the design and documentation of a number of open source projects. So in addition to Relay, there's also you're involved
native,
in like
Jest,
Prettier. Any like interesting things with those projects that are worth like sharing in terms of like the documentation and the design and what changed when you got involved?
I think a lot of them always is that the thing that really gets me like to start working on it is that I come up with a hook that like really resonates with me personally. So like for Jest, if you've not been to the Jest website, Jest has like a deck of cards that actually animate into place in front of you, and then it shows like this little spinning thing on the back of them, and they flip, and it tells you whether it's passed or failed. And like when I came up with that metaphor in my head, I just knew that I had to design the entire page with that as sort of like a core principle of like, here is the thing that how Jest can be visualized in an interesting way. And I think from there you can then start of saying, okay, so these card metaphors can be used to these other things, and you can describe the entire structure of Jest and its advantages through a lens of that. Prettier had the same thing, which is like Prettier's logo starts off completely messed up, and then it prettifies its own logo, and so it symbolizes its own the actions of its own system. React Native, for example, I had the idea of like, you have this sort of view DOM that like you don't think about it that way when you're a native developer. So I wanted to try to show like this interactive pattern, this pattern that you don't normally think about when you're a native developer in a way that feels natural to a web developer. Babel is one that I've got some designs for it, which is like I take the JavaScript logo and turn it into a Babel fish. It's really cute. I just need to get that out. And so for a lot of those, I know it's all just like me talking about me there, but like to some extent, if it's open source and it's in your spare time, you really do need something that like makes you individually feel good about the system and make you feel like it's worth the tens to hundreds of hours trying to get like the design passed by the teams and then sort of implemented. Because a lot of the time what I've done is I've just implemented the designs and I've said like, here's what it should look like on mobile, here's what it should look like on a desktop, and I will be there to finish the job when you get it 90% done, and I'll just deal with all the edge cases. But the thing has always been like, this is such low-hanging fruit. Like these are massive projects with millions of weekly downloads, and the way in which they describe themselves can be different depending on if you're external and internal. In part, like when I came to TypeScript, I was a completely external person. I'd seen, I knew nothing of the like internal baseball of Microsoft. I just knew, and I didn't have any of the prior history to TypeScript. So it's not like I had been in the team for, I think TypeScript's about 8 or 9 years old now. And had all that baggage, like back from when TypeScript was a very small project and it had to be very cautious about how it described itself, and especially when the view of Microsoft has changed a lot over the last 8 years too. TypeScript used to have like a very tiny little, this is a Microsoft project.
I remember when it first released, this is still during kind of like the pre-refresh of the Microsoft brand. I remember thinking like, this is like a trap of
This
some
is a
sort.
move. Yeah, this is 3D chess, and Microsoft have just played a very I mean, even then, I looked at TypeScript and was like, why would someone do this?
Yeah.
And it took until I reached a JavaScript code base that was of a reasonable size and
Yeah.
trying to make some changes that I started to realize that this was probably a good call.
Yeah. So I really like you mentioned like there's this gap between how the internal team, like the people actually building something, view it, because they have all the in-depth knowledge, they've been thinking about it forever, they're kind of like expert users of their own system, and then how newbies perceive it, external people first, who's are coming to a project for the first time. It seems like that informs a lot of your design goals. It's like making these frameworks and technologies accessible to newcomers. And when
Yeah.
we were talking earlier, you mentioned like something interesting about like TypeScript itself, like the way that, like when you joined the team, what was the gap in your view between how they perceived what TypeScript's purpose and value was, and how, like, the value that you saw in it as someone looking in from the outside in?
So, I think it's like that I had a more concentrated perspective of certain sets of things, because
Hmm.
like even internal to TypeScript, there's very little like consistent agreement on what TypeScript is and where its edges are. Like,
Hmm.
TypeScript has a design document that says like these are the sort of 10 golden rules of what TypeScript will be and won't be. So we will try to never break those.
Yeah.
But public perception and external perception is very different. Like for a lot of people, it's very rare to think of TypeScript as being buggy. But from internal perspective, we are getting like hundreds of comments a day saying this thing is broken in this way and this.
Yeah.
We got 5,000 open issues. A lot of them are very reasonable. But like from TypeScript's perspective, they've just evolved, and so TypeScript has an infinite backwards compatibility guarantee to a reasonable extent. So if you had a configuration set up today, from 5 years ago, it would still probably work, but you would get a lot of compiler errors now. So think about
Yeah.
it as like the project settings will still be the same, but the actual thing will be different.
Yeah.
Which can also sometimes be a bit of a noose around TypeScript's neck. A good example is decorators, which probably TypeScript adopted very early in order to get Angular support.
Yeah.
And decorators maybe next year will be spec'd out properly, and that will be different from the one in TypeScript, and we'll have to retain
Interesting.
old decorators and new decorators in the same code base forever. Can't break Angular.
No, that's a big project. A lot of people depend on that.
And so, like from TypeScript's perspective, like there's most of the engineers on this team have been here for 5+ years. So for them, TypeScript was still very when I came in, I was like, no, TypeScript is massive. Everybody uses it. Almost every major code base that I've have used is in the process of moving to it or has moved to it. Like when we say, when you tell me that we have these stories of people migrating away from TypeScript, in the last 2 years, I've read maybe like 3 or 4 blog posts ever about that. And like internally, they knew that people migrated away from TypeScript because people used to migrate away from TypeScript. And I'm not saying that that's never going to be a time when people don't migrate away, but that the value of the types and the tooling are enough to keep people, even if they're not happy with the way in which errors can be presented, because that's a very complicated thing too. And so there was a lot of like naive external person saying like, hey, look, I've never seen anyone migrate away from TypeScript, and all these big flow projects are moving to TypeScript now. Like the perception of what you think TypeScript is and how it is seen from the outside is very different.
Can you tell the story of how you joined the TypeScript team?
Yeah.
Like, did they recruit you, or?
No, they had a GitHub issue that said, we are hiring. And I pitched specifically that I would not be a good compiler engineer. And I am
the
not
hiring rec was for like someone with a compiler background, right?
Yeah. And so, like I tell juniors, apply for a senior job. And conceptually, I have done the same thing here. I applied and said, "Well, I'm not actually what you're asking for."
That's awesome.
And I said that, like, TypeScript is like a little village, and there's a castle in the center, and that's the TypeScript compiler, and it powers all this tooling and all these other things. But that, like, the scope of TypeScript has this massive ecosystem of people building tools using TypeScript, using the language, doing the parsing, and all of those folks are not really being catered to by the TypeScript team. In part because the TypeScript team is a bunch of compiler nerds, and they want to be doing compilery stuff and the documentation and the web infrastructure and stuff like that. Whilst it gets done, it doesn't it's not like a core focus for any of the individuals on the TypeScript team, at least prior to me. And so the problem was that a lot of the good stuff was all closed source too. So when I wanted to contribute to the Playground or to the TypeScript website, I couldn't, because none of that was available for me. And so
a lot of the tooling in the ecosystem was still closed source in those days.
Yeah, the web and documentation infrastructure. So it wasn't something that I could just I couldn't just go to like I did to Relay and just say I will redesign all your stuff. Here's your website, so I'll do that. It was much harder to be able to do that to TypeScript. Plus, it was also like a commercial entity in ways that others aren't. That would have made it hard to just go out of the blue and say it.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I pitched that that ecosystem outreach and sort of trying to figure out what it looks like to be from an external person interacting with TypeScript was what I pitched, and I must have won against compiler engineers to get that space.
You sold them.
Yeah, exactly. And honestly, I think I've done a good job at all of this. I think I've got a lot of the good documentation out. I got new handbooks. We've got new the Playground is some of the best work I've ever done, to be honest. And it's this incredible environment for doing all sorts of great things in. And I think for anybody using TypeScript, it is much easier now to learn TypeScript and to sort of jump from intermediate to experienced is still a bit of a gap, but almost every other part of the TypeScript learning process is now significantly better.
Yeah. Can you talk more about the Playground? Because I think that's one of the most delightful pieces of the TypeScript documentation, or the TypeScript learning TypeScript experience. How did you? I think it a very limited version existed before you, and what did you? How did you come in and change that and completely revamp that?
So from day one, the TypeScript website had a Playground.
Okay.
Day one, because TypeScript is made in JavaScript and TypeScript, so it was a feature that was highlighted straight away. Was we can run TypeScript in a web browser. Here it is. And again, this is a goal of TypeScript at the beginning that is less of a goal now, and that was that TypeScript would always try and emit the most beautiful version of the JavaScript it possibly could. And so for TypeScript, it was a priority to be able to very easily see the output JavaScript. In a way, we don't have that conceptual. We don't think about it that way nowadays in the ecosystem. You don't sit there and look at your transpiled JavaScript. But when that idea first came out, the idea of first not truly putting the code that you're making into production,
it was controversial.
It was controversial.
Yeah.
And you wanted proof, and you wanted to be able to see that the code that you were putting in made some sense. And that was the goal of the TypeScript Playground, which is obviously quite a different goal from what the Playground is today. And so what I said coming in was I wanted the Playground to be an environment for learning in. I want the Playground to be an environment for experimenting in. And I want the Playground to be an environment for compiler engineers to use to sort of pitch and prove their ideas and improvements. So the third one is maybe the quickest, so I'll start at the end and work backwards.
Yeah.
All of the features that I pitched I wanted to make sure were also good for the TypeScript compiler team. So sort of an easy way to set any possible configuration variable, an easy way to be able to choose a different version of TypeScript at any point in time. And nightly builds would be available inside the playground. So there was this sort of decoupling of the version of TypeScript from the sort of user interface of the website that needed to happen.
Yeah.
But nowadays it's very common for almost any like complicated feature being built in TypeScript to just ask for a playground build that you can just do on the TypeScript pull request. And so, a really good example is the pipeline operators, which are something that's really exciting for JavaScript. It's a new way of piping data through your JavaScript code. And it's far from being spec'd out correctly. So an internet rando created a pull request to TypeScript implementing almost all of it twice in two different ways. And then we make a playground for it. And that gives people the environment to be able to play around with this in a real, like as though it was a real editor and as though this is like a real version of TypeScript. And it is a real version of TypeScript, and it is obviously a real-ish editor. And so that's really great for the TypeScript team. And so then for the other two is like, there's an infrastructure called the Playground plugin system, which allows anybody to make their own individual plugins to the TypeScript Playground. Think of it like VS Code extensions, but for the Playground. And there's not that many other people using it, but I am using it a lot. And that is like a great. That means it's a great abstraction in my mind. Because there's tons of like ways in which, as compiler engineers, we have different needs from other people. And I can build these little one-off plugins for compiler engineers that nobody else needs. So rather than jamming the playground full of like really clever, complicated tools for understanding the TypeScript like under the hood, instead I can just say, hey, just install that plugin, and now you can see the results of a scanner at a different point in time and see how the flow graph is generated.
That's really cool.
Yeah, so exactly.
Is it very much like an editor plugin where you get kind of these inline annotations into the code, or like certain highlights, or
it's all of those? Yeah, exactly. You have all of those APIs are available for you, and so it just depends on what you need. And so that sort of thing again is a really great thing for the TypeScript compiler team. And really great for individuals because people can play with. We can make their own plugins. Somebody added Vim support to the playground via a plugin. As well as people that are also exploring how do I sort of share the code, how do I built a real-time collaboration tool so you can have two people on the same playground at the same time. There's all sorts of things that is available for, which kind of brings us neatly into learning. I mentioned earlier that there are so many different ways that people do learn, and like a great set of documentation does many things, but you usually have like a sort of guided tour, like the main tutorial. In TypeScript we call it the handbook. And then we have like lots of reference pages. So if you want to go deep dive on something like, what happens when I click on a name, a path, and it finds its way to somewhere else, what is the module resolution? Like that sort of stuff you can get in reference, and that's complicated code, and so it's very complicated reference documentation. But there needs to be somewhere between I can read from A to Z, and I would like to build a system where I can play around once the ideas have been presented to me. So almost every code block in the new TypeScript handbook has a click to go to the playground with this code inside it, where you can then instantly try and figure out like what happens if I change this, or if I break it in this system in this way, how does that work? And so the playground is considered like one of the tenets of learning TypeScript. It maybe even further in the fifth redesign may be considered like almost the second level of importance with the handbook. And in that case, you're like, we present you with this just list of topics, and they're like, here you go. You want to learn about, I don't know, sets. You click on this and you're in a playground with sets, comments everywhere, and you can just type in wherever you want and see how it works.
That's awesome. It's like learn by doing, like get people into the code and tinkering and playing around with it as quickly as possible.
Yeah, exactly. That's the goal. And the playground does a really good job of giving people an environment to work in. Like I always compare it to the Swift playgrounds. Apple have really good like really solid sort of little iPad app that you can use to like just play around with the language and try and understand how it all comes together. And I take a lot of inspiration from like how they are doing it, because they're a fully staffed team working on one thing, and the Playground is one of my side projects. So just trying to get it all together.
Yeah. When I think about the programming language ecosystems that have really been successful, a lot of the times I think the major reason for their success is not just the language itself. Obviously the language is important, the syntax and the type system and whatnot. But the whole like ecosystem of tooling around it and the overall developer experience plays such a big role, because that in turn leads to like there's almost like a coefficient of like how easy this thing is to like adopt or dive into. And that feeds into like, if you try to model it out, it's like that's your growth coefficient. So like every percentage or like every point that you can reduce or increase that
the friction there.
Your slope goes up, and that's what makes it that increases the likelihood you reach critical mass and take off velocity and all that.
When I joined JavaScript and was debating between Flow and TypeScript, Flow had a better pitch because of that, which was that Flow is just JavaScript with types, and TypeScript is a language. I'm air quoting if you're listening to this. In both cases, it's the exact same, but it's just the angle in which it was pitched was different. And basically, in the last 2 or 3 years, TypeScript has really done a good job of sort of helping other tools adopt TypeScript at a different scale. So like the Babel plugin for TypeScript, so that you can use TypeScript in a Babel project, is one of the most fundamental things that happened to TypeScript, that allowed people to not feel like they're living in a TypeScript only ecosystem. They're now just living in an ecosystem where TypeScript is an option, right? It's not like I have to only use TypeScript tools. It is I just do a .ts file and the rest of my tools work with it.
Yeah. When I think about Flow versus TypeScript, and I'm not like an expert in either, so this is just like pure speculation on my part, but when I think about like why TypeScript has seen like wild success to the point where it's like it's almost like it's so deeply integrated into the JS ecosystem that like a lot of the npm packages, even you're writing pure JS, like chances are like a lot of the packages you've installed were like written in TypeScript and then transpiled into JS, whereas like Flow is still kind of, to me it seems like very Facebook centric. And I almost feel like the starting point, like you said, like originally if you'd asked me back in what was it, like 2014 2015, which one of these would become more dominant, I'd be like Flow. Facebook had the better
React,
I think like developer brand at the time. They had React. It was just JavaScript. It wasn't like a completely new language, but the way it's played out, I think you're absolutely right. Like Microsoft and the TypeScript team, they deserve a lot of credit for just actively engaging the open source community and making the effort to make it easy to adopt TypeScript in all these different projects.
Yeah, I can't stress enough how the higher ups in Microsoft are making good decisions here.
Yeah.
Like all the way from 8 years ago when TypeScript was pitched, all the way to still now, like some of the highest levels of Microsoft, TypeScript is just considered like this, not even like this golden goose that's continually laying like these eggs. It is just like, this is a really successful Microsoft project. We don't want to interfere with it. We want to make sure that we're steering it in a way that like fits with VS Code and Visual Studio, but not to the detriment of the language, especially not to the detriments of like the VS Code and Visual Studio. But that like that it feels good and that it still feels somewhat Microsoft-y. Like, and the organization that I'm in is called Developer Division, and it's just all developer tools. And it's very different because normally these sort of tools like TypeScript live in a completely different one, like the languages and ecosystem tooling space. We don't answer to the F# people or the C# people, but like almost every other Microsoft language does. And this was like an experiment in trying to give it its own space to
Interesting.
to work out, and it has obviously worked out well. And a lot of that is sort of owed to the higher ups that normally you would never even think about as being involved in something like this. Just saying, yeah, we'll give it a shot and we'll see where it goes, and it worked out. Someone had to have said the same for VS Code, right?
Yeah.
Like that's like taking the thing that gets you almost as much money as maybe Windows, Visual Studio,
Yeah.
and just saying, yeah, we'll make a free competitor to it. Sure, give it a shot.
Yeah.
They did it though, and
Yeah.
obviously it worked. But that takes a level of vision that is hard to be hard to think that I would have made those same decisions. Is maybe a right way to say it. Like,
Yeah.
like you want to protect your babies, and making the first open source language that is well used outside of Microsoft was probably not something someone wanted to necessarily give that control away.
Yeah.
It's good.
Yeah. The way I think about it is like, long-term self-interest versus short-term self-interest. And a lot of times it's like so easy to make those short-term self-interested decisions where you kind of like locally optimize, but then lose sight of this like, bigger opportunity both for you and, the surrounding community that you're trying to contribute to and thrive in. And it's a big bet, right? Because it's harder to justify. Someone has to kind of like step up and take a risk and say like, we're going to do it this way, even though it's not like directly tied to, the bottom line in any of these divisions. We think this is overall going to be, better for Microsoft and better for the community
The ecosystem
at large. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think TypeScript has done a good job, and Microsoft, and especially our division, has done a good job of knowing when to make the pie bigger versus when to try and make your slice of the pie bigger.
Yeah.
And I think VS Code is a really good example of making the pie bigger. Like, I think I read recently, though I don't know the exact where this came from, that 50% of all programmers are JavaScript people.
Yeah.
Which must mean that, like, making tools available to them and making tools available for them to edit. I know, right? Must have been like such a conceptual thing that, like, okay, if we can just increase that, make it easier for more people to do JavaScript, then bang, we'll get all the Cambrian explosion of Node and Electron and obviously TypeScript, and all of those things sort of come together in a really neat and interesting way.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, I want to talk about Shiki 2/, because that's the new thing right now that you kind of recently released, and it's really cool. So can you tell me and tell us, I guess, what is it, and why is it useful?
Sure, I love Shiki 2/. So there's one interesting thing is that I've probably only had a few good ideas in my entire life. And I know, but what I'm really good at is taking somebody else's good idea that they have a rough idea of and maybe could turn out well, and just be like, I'm going to take this, I'm going to polish it until it's incredible. And that's what I did with Cocoapods, and that's what I did with Shiki 2/. There was a rough draft of what the TypeScript new documentation could look like before I arrived. And one of its thing was that we verify every single TypeScript documentation sort of code chunk ahead of time. And so that we can know that the docs are not out of sync with the compiler. Pretty common thing, like a linter system, kind of normal tooling. And someone said to me, like, well, what about if we try and take some of the editor features and put that in there? And I was just like blown away of like, what does it look like to sort of statically take all of the interesting IDE features and put those inside the code blocks? And it was not really a space that anybody else had explored. And so we had to sort of think about, like, what does it look like to create special code blocks with like TypeScript specific markup in there? And it turned out that TypeScript already had 2 different flavors of markup inside the code base for the compiler. I know. So, the TypeScript compiler's testing system is mostly integration tests. So basically, we make it so it's very trivial to create a single file that represents a complicated TypeScript project.
Sure.
And there's two different ways to do that depending on the way in which you want to test. And so that's either a /test or a /test, both of which have different like markup semantics. And so I took the idea of // out of the compiler and re-implemented it myself in a way that would run on the web.
So I guess really quick, // is like, it's called // because there's like 2 slashes, and then you have some sort of like metadata in that, like the compiler will interpret it as a comment, but then in the comments you have these annotations that are semantically meaningful for the test that's being run, right?
Yes.
Okay.
So yeah, exactly. We just call it // because it's just a normal comment, and then you usually put an @ after it to indicate that some work is about to happen, and that will get erased from from the end result of your code sample.
Yeah.
So a very common case would be, I want to have a code sample that has strict turned off. So I would do // space @ strict : false, and that would not be emitted in the JavaScript or the TypeScript at the end, but that all goes into like this sort of virtual file system, so you can have multiple files, and then it all sort of gets printed back out as though an editor has sort of shown it to you, which is quite complicated in a few different places. But at a high level, the interesting thing here is that like, you can get mouse over hovers, you can get compiler errors being pulled out, and you can do things like mouse hovers in line. And so you can declare, this thing, this identifier here, I want to show the type of it. And in // that is just a comment with a little arrow and a hat next to it saying this thing here is interesting, so you should show it out. And so you write like how Markdown turns to HTML, you would write like // style TypeScript, and it comes out as a normal normal TypeScript file with a lot of additional metadata on top of it. And then that is this really rich, really powerful tool for describing complicated code. And the thing about something like tricky // is that it requires a little bit of understanding to get to that point too. It's a bit like Relay in the same way. If I told you could get cool syntax highlighting on a code sample, that's uninteresting. If I tell you, because that's available, right? Because that's a baseline.
Right.
If I tell you that you can run the TypeScript checker on your code samples, that's at least a little bit interesting.
Yeah.
Because you can keep that running over a long time period, and that your code sample's not going to go out of sync. But if you tell someone that like you can get the code samples were checked, and then that provides all these extra user tools, like all this great user experience for people reading the code samples, that's when people get excited. But you kind of have to like reach that point through explanation first.
And for those listening, or like, you should just go to the Shiki2 / docs page. They have the embedded code snippets that the project itself emits, and you can see for yourself there's like hovers and autocomplete and a lot of the standard editor niceties, but in an embedded code snippet in the documentation, which is
that's done entirely in markup, and it's all static HTML.
That's awesome.
Yeah, exactly. And
it's all so there's no like JavaScript. It just like generates everything so like even if you have JavaScript turned off or whatever, it will work. Okay.
Because it has to run inside an EPUB and a PDF. So it literally has to run in all these different environments, and so I cannot make assumptions like that. Which, because we wanted to be able to ship a handbook to people to reuse offline, and that needs to be auto-generated, and so all of this stuff needs to do. These were like constraints of the TypeScript website that then turned out to be useful for almost any documentation.
That's awesome.
Please.
I was just gonna say, like, the code snippets, I feel like are always the most useful part of the documentation for me. A lot of times I just go from code snippet to code snippet and copy and paste a bunch of stuff to try it out and see how it works. Because
well, that's why they have a try button on them, right? Like in the TypeScript website, so that you can do that really trivially. But again, like the advantage here with Shiki2 / is that we can just show you a bunch of these code samples in a row, and we can highlight the parts that are interesting to you as you go through, and you don't have to think about it too much. The current redesign of TypeScript website actually does this at a meta level layer. So I'm not sure if it'll go into Shiki2/ as an abstraction, but it might, which is I want the ability to annotate a code sample from outside of the code sample. So think about it as like I want to be able to write like a marker note and point at a particular line or symbol, because I want you to. This is the thing I want you to be thinking about, and I want to give you these sets of ideas ahead of time, so that you can skim through these code samples and be like, yeah, that thing, yeah, that's what I was thinking it was, and then seeing these annotations. That is the future of Shiki2/ probably, but also like the future of how we're describing TypeScript. Because sometimes like showing these code samples and then showing what is the rough TLDR here, I think is better than trying to like have some text ahead and after trying to describe it, because people won't read those, but they would read it if it was attached to the code sample itself. User testing. People don't read. People skim. If you can provide an easy way.
Attention span,
Yeah, it's been incredible watching people user test the websites. Like, for all the ones that I talked about with a cool pitch, that then like people play with that concept for a bit and then just scroll down. But I can't do that so much with TypeScript because it's a bit more serious. So I need to have these ways of like making people skim and be able to understand enough to be able to decide whether to make a decision or not.
Yeah, awesome. Let's talk about the design, the visual design of the Shiki2/ documentation itself, because it's very bold and unique. And I'm going to kick this off just by like reading the intro section of the documentation, just to give people a flavor of what the style is like, because I think the written style reflects the visual style too. So it begins: the documentation concerning the NPM modules of Shiki2/, in which markdown code samples are powered by the syntax engine of Visual Studio Code, mixed with the TypeScript compiler's information, by Orta Therox, purveyor of renowned open source code and TypeScript compiler team member.
Yeah, it's just perfect. So the entire thing has this great old world,
Shakespearean almost.
Yeah, my first drafts for this actually had more of the documentation in this old world voice. But after reading a few paragraphs of it, it actually gets quite like you start to really zone out. So I'm like, okay, it can work above the fold, but it probably can't work below the fold. There are unbelievably great tools today for creating documentation websites. Especially, the two key ones are Docusaurus and Tailwind also does a great job of having really great foundations for anybody to recreate a good website without design skills. And basically, to some extent, all of these documentation websites are all starting to look the exact same. I have enough skills to really play around in the space and to like really feel like try and make it stand out on its own feet, as well as being a pretty complicated tool like Shiki2/. And so I really wanted to sort of go deep on a sort of a really creative take on this sort of design work. And I'm really happy with how it turned out. I thought it's actually
beautiful and gorgeous. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah.
And unique.
Exactly. One of the things about the Shiki2/ is if you scroll back to the bottom, there's a link that takes you to my design document. And you can actually, I left every draft of the Shiki2/ website in the design document, so you can actually see it evolve as a concept. I originally had this kind of idea of like 1950s ice creamy Americana thing going on. And then I kind of felt a bit off on that when then one day just found this incredible book and saw this book and was like, wow, I really love the style of this book. I want to like copy the book exactly and try and get the feel of it. And then once I got far into that iteration, I realized that like it just didn't feel right. It felt muddy, sort of like trying to emulate the book too far made it not feel like
which book was this?
It's a book on it's a maths book that was one of the first ever book to include graphs and so they used a very like colorful. They didn't have any of the rules that we have about
Right.
you put a graph in a particular position, the order of things is this way. Like there's just text intermingled with pictures everywhere. But they had a very limited color palette.
Yeah.
Uh, and once I got far enough into copying the book, I realized that I just couldn't copy the book, and I needed to take the ideas from the book and reapply it into a modern context. And that's what you're seeing today. You're seeing like 1600s ideas reapplied using today's tools. And so it's built to still feel like a book, but it's not telling you that too much. Like the structure of how there is like a side margin that's meant to emulate the edge of a page, the way in which it describes itself as chapters, is meant to make you think that this is old school, but not get in the way that like an old school system of design would have.
Yeah.
It's like good skeuomorphism is how I like to think about that sort of idea.
Yeah. That's so cool. And you mentioned that a lot of the other documentation sites are starting to look the same, in part because of there's kind of these standard popular automatic doc gen tools now, and you get like a great design, but it's the standard design. But I almost feel like it almost becomes self-fulfilling at some point, where now, like, I feel like it's not just because people are using the same tools that they end up with the same design. Like, actual human designers are starting to move like companies' design to this kind of like how to describe it, just like this plain, featureless, like vanilla Helvetica-esque aesthetic, to the point where like logos now, which used to be like all sorts of different fonts and colors, that it seems like we're all just converging on the same like platonic ideal. Like, what is your take on this interesting trend in the design world?
I mean, it's fashion, and like it will go away in time. I don't. It's not my bag. My design style is like very big, bold colors. Very flat, but still using depth in interesting ways. And as I mentioned earlier, like, and I'm air quoting, good skeuomorphism. Like reusing existing concepts that people know about in order to like not have to learn all of these different things. I think it's, again, I think the tools are so good and so easy that like almost every website will slowly move to use Tailwind, and we'll be in a similar stage as where we were with Bootstrap.
I was gonna say it's the new Bootstrap.
And that is both good and bad, right? Bootstrap is more restrictive than Tailwind is, so conceptually you can see more experimentation in using Tailwind. But at the end of the day, like if you want a website that looks like a 2020s tech website, you use Tailwind. That's it, and it will look that, and it will tell you something. Like I've been building. I have a side project called Capture with some of my friends, which is automatic Zoom recording, and it sends it off into Google Drive or something. And we just reused all those design ideas to make it look like a tech website, and that was the goal. The goal was look like a generic tech website, so that people will look at it and be like, "Oh yeah, okay. If it looks like all the other ones, then it must be as high quality and blah 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 as all the rest of them." And so that can be a shortcut.
But Orta, I thought the whole point of design was to kind of project a unique personality into things. Is that not a big part of it? Like, are we kind of forgetting why?
It's a reasonable statement, right? Like almost every website nowadays will use something like Tailwind. Will have the flat humans flat humans on it with multicultural, multicolored ways, and they're all that will look samey simply because everybody's using the same design assets and more or less the same color palette, and the same CSS frameworks, and that is just how it is going to be for a while, and that is okay. Like if it's empowering people to do things, like it doesn't, not every artist has to try and go for impressionism. Lots of people are just trying to pitch an interesting idea in other ways, and not every website I build wants. I've yet to build a website that looks like a Docusaurus one, or even or looks like a Tailwind one. but I have used Bootstrap to build like the Cocoapods webpage, and that doesn't look like a Bootstrap website. Like these tools are things that you can build on top of, and there'll be people experimenting in these spaces that will do really interesting work. Like I think GitHub are doing really great design at the moment. I don't know if you saw, for example, the new GitHub issues page that came out recently.
Oh yeah, it looks snazzy.
It looked really snazzy. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't be surprised if that was built on sort of something like Tailwind. And like, it's the designers there taking the ideas of Tailwind and reusing the existing concepts and actually just mixing them together in a way that's completely feels unique and still feels like GitHub. And I think trying to figure out a like consistent brand identity is something that would be like, I think you need a designer to be thinking at that level of abstraction. It's quite rare for an individual programmer, and especially in open source, right, where people don't necessarily need to think much about like the brand outside of persuading people that it's a good tool.
Yeah.
Trying when I joined Jest, I was like, you should have the logo be the word Jest written out in a way that could fit in the console too, so that it would match. The TypeScript logo is now in the help for TypeScript because it's just a square in blue with TS.
Yeah.
And like connecting all those dots together and making it all feel like a cohesive strategy. It's not really something a lot of people particularly find fun, probably.
Yeah.
And
there's a whole system, like design system. Yeah. In other words, that you have to implement, and that's
time. Yeah.
Yeah.
And design systems are really fun at the same time, but they're also restrictive in the same way, right? Like the goal of a design system is to put constraints on what you do so that it's consistent everywhere. And so that constraint can breed creativity, but it's also the constraint means that is your brand. Like you don't see Nike going around having different types of ticks because, there's only one tick. That's the design system.
Yeah.
And trying to find ways to allow people to have creativity within that space. I think like Nike's a good example. They allow for it to like be hollow, and so you can use it to sort of show some text on the inside, different colors, things like that. But they still have the constraint.
I get what you're saying. Like there's a lot of work that goes into a design system, and it's very easy to just use the out of the box thing. But like, why are they all the same? Like why it feels like there's almost this like conservatism creeping in, and just like are the designers on board with this, or is it kind of like this like corporate like, oh, we just want to do the standard thing, and that's like the kind of low risk, it's not going to be outstanding, it's not going to be distinctive, people aren't going to talk about it, but at least it won't be terrible, and so CYA, like let's just go with this. That is that like a dynamic, or all the designers like, oh no, actually this is fantastic. Like, yeah, we're finally, after all these years, we finally convinced everyone in the world to converge on the perfect design.
That's the one. We are converging on absolute pinnacle of perfection. I like to think about this in the same way that I thought about design for Mac development back in the day. There used to be a human, well, there still is, a human interface guidelines, right? There's a set of primitives that everybody uses, but you would still have people that would just reach for the stars, do unique designs that had all this really cool things that built on top of these existing things, existing primitives. And they had two problems on top of the like having a great design. They first of all had to implement them, and second, they had to maintain them as trends changed. And if you were like bleeding edge, just like in fashion, like a year later, that is not going to look like it looked in your mind, because something has changed. In the Mac days, that was like Apple has decided to use transparency here instead of using a shadow. And adopting, who knows? I was already tired of people adopting like flat humans before Dropbox did, and after Dropbox, then everybody did.
Is that like the kind of like predominant like avatar kind of artistic style now that you're referencing? Okay,
I am. Like you'll know them. They're like representational people that usually don't.
A friend was like Allegria. Is that that name? Or I
That
forget
might
what
have
the name
been
was.
one of the
Some,
artists, but I always just refer to them as flat people. I don't know if
okay,
there's a better
flat
one.
people. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like it is kind of impressionistic, like the art style, which is,
I see.
try and reduce as much as possible the form of a human, which is an
Yeah.
interesting problem.
And it was like
And
interesting when like one person did it for the first time, but now it's like, you know,
everywhere.
everywhere. But I guess
And that's the problem, right? Do a good
that's
idea.
the paradox of success, I
Yeah.
guess.
It's like the game Freeze. It was like it introduced this idea that somebody stole and created 1024. And 1024 is this massive game that everybody knows that has a million clones of 1024, but that's just a clone of an original idea. And everybody looks at the original one. It's like, why did you copy this? And you made it really restrictive. You took out all the
Oh man.
all these extra accessibility things that were in the other one. And so yeah, the success of somebody else with your idea can sometimes be a bit painful, but it's tricky. Yeah, and like this is just fashion. Like the design of things is. That's why developers sometimes like stay clear of this sort of stuff. Like if you choose to use Tailwind, then yeah, you're adopting Tailwind, and it's going to look very similar, like I did with Capture. But the trade-off there is that like it does look similar, and it feels like a techish website, and there's a minimum bar of quality just by adopting it. Like it's going to work well on mobile. It's going to work well on an old browser. All I have to think about is what CSS classes go in a certain place. And if it's so well adopted, then it's going to have so many tutorials and like people describing the problem in different ways that should make it very easy to learn regardless of your style of learning.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a trend. There'll always be trends. And this current one, but like, almost every trend goes too far almost every single time, right? Like skeuomorphism on the iPhone went too far,
Right.
and then Apple took it too far with flat design, and then now people are sort of taking Tailwind too far in the web ecosystem, and maybe there'll be an anti-Tailwind push back from that, and maybe there'll just be a new generation of something else. But whatever it is, it helps a lot of people get good looking things done. And
yeah,
that's the thing. Like you get a better
that's
experience because someone's using it, even if it does feel samey. It's tricky.
Makes sense. All right, so we're coming up on the end of time here, but I wish there was, more time because there's a lot more to talk about. But as kind of a parting thought, if there's one thing that you want a person, watching this or listening to this to go and do now, what would that be?
I want people to think about how GitHub should be encouraging companies to sponsor individuals in open source. And I don't have any good answers to this myself yet, but I think the only way that we can get like a sort of, and I'm air quoting again, audio people, a sort of middle class of open source people just doing open source, is by finding ways for companies to be encouraging to sponsor individuals. Because I think what we're seeing right now in GitHub sponsors is individuals sponsoring individuals, and I think the way in which we can get like me to only work on doing redesigns of big JavaScript libraries or improving their tooling full time outside of being employed in TypeScript is through that sort of system. And thinking about ways to improve that, I think, could have massive ecosystem effects.
Awesome. All right. Well, Orta, thanks so much for joining us today. This was great, and I feel like we should have you back because there's more that we didn't get to that it'd be good to talk about. But thanks for your time today, and thanks for being a guest on this show.
Same. Thanks for having me. It was such a pleasure.